Friends, in this episode, I'm going to tell you a story which could be the final climax of this war. It's about the 450 kilos of missing uranium, which was the whole point of this war in some ways. But before I do that, please like and subscribe my channel, and if possible, share any short or long video that you enjoy in your social networks. Somewhere in the mountains of Iran lie 450 kilos of 60% enriched uranium and about 18 to 20 canisters, about the size of a scuba diving tank. The most likely location is in the underground tunnel complex close to the town of Isfahan in Iran, somewhere in central Iran. This is where the American intelligence and the IAEA believe this uranium lies, but they are not 100% sure. Some of it could be in other locations within Iran. Now, David Albright, who is considered the dean, the grandfather of non-proliferation studies, and who himself is a scientist and used to work for the IAEA, believes that this 60% might not be enough for a very powerful explosion. For that, you need 90% enrichment. But this is sufficient for a Hiroshima-Nagasaki sized bomb, a crude weapon. Now, there are three ways of dealing with this. I'll cover all three ways. The first is special forces operations by American or Israeli special forces or combined. The second way is to negotiate with the Iranians through diplomacy. And the third is to leave this where it is and to keep observing it with satellites, with spy planes, etc. The problem that could arise is that certain terrorist or rogue forces could try to take control over this, not because they can make a weapon out of it. They could make maybe a crude, dirty bomb. They couldn't make a proper weapon because they don't have the equipment, and also it's very dangerous. It's already very highly enriched uranium and so could be toxic. But they could also use it as an insurance policy, negotiate against it, or disperse it. Second danger is that the Iranian government itself could come and either take it for further enrichment because they still have surviving centrifuges underground, and also they have the nuclear scientists. I mean, Israel had killed most of the senior scientists in June of 2025. But large number of junior scientists who have sufficient knowledge exist. Or the Iranians themselves could disperse this uranium across Iran, which would make it very difficult to then secure it later on. If special forces were to raid it, they would have embedded nuclear scientists. In fact, the United States has a facility about the size of a shipping container somewhere in Tennessee. This can be transported anywhere in the world through a cargo plane. It's called the Mobile Uranium Facility. This can secure the nuclear material. It can even secure centrifuges and other kinds of radioactive material. But this would be a very highly risky operation. In fact, most likely the Iranians are also watching this and have troops around this area. Therefore, any attack, even if it is done by special forces along with helicopters, gunships, with planes, etc., would face stiff resistance, and there would be high casualties, which so far the Americans, at least President Trump, has not shown the stomach for. This is because 75% of Americans oppose the use of ground forces. And as I've told you before, polling is showing that up to 50 to 60% of Americans are against the war itself. This factor, along with the steep rise in oil prices and the consequent decline in the stock markets, is what led President Trump yesterday to say that the war could be over very soon. Then he said, no, not this week, but within a short time. He in fact said it won't be more than a few weeks. This was in order to reassure the stock markets, in order to reassure the oil markets. And yes, oil then came down from about $110, $115 a barrel to about 95 or so, 92. And the stock markets also recovered. But most people, including Elbridge Colby, who's the undersecretary in the Defense Department, or what's called the Department of War now, said in a public statement, public speech, that we cannot leave without securing this. And in fact, the American government has held closed-door briefings for their parliamentarians, their senators, representatives, on how they are going to deal with this. So they haven't given a firm yes or no whether they're going to use special forces, but they are constantly watching this, they said, and it is one of their prime concerns. The other option of using diplomacy doesn't seem very promising either, because the Iranians now are not going to trust the Americans and Israelis. They have twice attacked them while negotiating, and in fact, even in 2018, in a deal which said that any uranium above 20% enrichment would be either diluted down to 3.5% or be transported to Russia. And it was done so. the Iranians did transport the highly enriched uranium either to Russia or diluted it. We know this because the IAEA certified this through its inspectors, and the CIA and NSA in America verified it. But now the Iranians are not going to trust the Americans and Israelis. Moreover, hardliners might feel it's better to dash to a nuclear weapon than to comply with these kind of negotiations. And as I have already explained, the third option of leaving the material behind is also not an option which the Israelis or Americans will accept because of the dangers of both the regime and the possible rogue forces. So we seem to be headed for a face-off or a showdown on this issue. On top of that is the issue that the Israelis are not willing to accept the continuation of the Iranian government itself. They are saying anybody who's appointed to the top post will be eliminated. And Trump himself has said that Mojtaba Khamenei is not acceptable to him. So along with Ali Larijani, who's actually controlling the forces right now in Iran, the Americans and Israelis would also be looking for Mojtaba Khamenei. But it's not so simple. They have not been able to eliminate Ali Larijani in over 10 days. I'm sure they are looking for him constantly. So it's unlikely that they would immediately be able to locate Khamenei also. And as you know, Khamenei has always been a hardliner. Also now that his father, mother, sister, wife and son all have been killed, he's unlikely to compromise easily. In fact, this is possibly one of the reasons that he has been appointed, because this kind of a huge sacrifice has great value in Shia Islam. And he would be considered as a sacrificer, his relatives would be considered martyrs, and so this gives him more credibility. Also, there is of course the practical reason that he is very close to the IRGC, certain factions of the IRGC. He himself has fought in the Iran-Iraq war, and he was not only close to the IRGC but also close to the clerics, because he himself is a qualified cleric from Qom, one of the centers of Shia Islam. In fact, the chief center of Shia Islam within Iran. The other big center is Najaf in Iraq. So he's also familiar with the foreign and defense policies of the Iranian Republic. Hence, he not only brings together all the factions within the Iranian government, but he also hits the ground running. That is, you don't have to prepare him. He's already ready. Any other candidate would have to first come up to pace, understand all of these complexities, and in the middle of a war, which is probably the most stressful period in modern Iranian history, the clerics and the IRGC don't want to take that risk. So because of these two reasons, that 450 kilos of missing uranium and a hardline leadership which is still intact, it is unlikely that the Israelis and Americans can immediately stop the war. Even though now Israel and America's interests are diverging, as I've explained earlier. Israel wants, if not an overthrow of the current government, then a shattering of Iran. That is, leave it in pieces either through rebellions of its minorities or through a civil war within the regime, that is different factions within the IRGC, the army, the Basij, etc. And that's why they've been targeting the fuel depots, the oil infrastructure, stadiums, hospitals, schools, etc. Whereas the Americans have not been doing that. Their interests are not in leaving behind a chaos. As I've explained earlier, this would be a big problem for both the oil supplies from the region. This would also create a big problem in air travel. And that's why the GCC Arab countries are also with the Americans on this, because they have to live beside an Iran even tomorrow after this is over. They know Iran is not leaving anywhere. So a chaos there would also destroy their economies. So the GCC interests and American interests are more aligned now. And Israel, which is trying to push and pressurize the Americans through the Israel lobby in America, as I've explained earlier, has differing interests. They're trying to keep the Americans in the battle. But still, it doesn't look like Trump is going to stay long in this war, and he's looking for exit options. In fact, the Americans were angry with the Israelis for having attacked the oil infrastructure. They don't want that to be touched. Meanwhile, Iran, over the last 2-3 months, has been using earth-moving equipment in this region of the Isfahan underground complex. They're trying to put more and more earth on the openings that the American bombs had created. And now only a very small opening has been left because they realized that Americans could attack again. In fact, one proposal is not to send in special forces, but use heavy bombing in that region to leave it completely destroyed. So the uranium will either be buried under tons and tons of sand or will get dispersed. Of course, that whole area will then become radioactive. But that's, according to them, better, at least according to the Israelis, better than that falling into the hands of the Iranian government. But it would still leave them feeling insecure, because in case the canisters don't get destroyed, they could always be dug out. So please keep watching And until next time, like and subscribe my content.